This video was brought to you by Debunked. More about that at the end of the video. The Bible, unquestionably the most influential book of all time, has been used to inspire great acts of charity, kindness, and magnificent works of art, and to justify horrific wars and atrocities. Nearly 2,000 years after the last book of the Bible was penned, billions still turn to it for insight, many of them holding to the belief in its divine inspiration, preservation, and unchanging inerrancy. But does the Bible that you read today contain the same preserved content, or at least the same general message penned by its authors all of those generations ago? Just how much, if at all, has the Bible changed? I want to begin by focusing predominantly on the New Testament, because we have significantly more information on how it came together. The events recounted in the New Testament take place in the 1st century CE or AD, and largely deal with the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, as well as the history of the early church. The first gospel is believed to have been penned around 35 years after Jesus died. But before a single word was written, the stories about Jesus were passed around by word of mouth, by followers fleeing persecution, attempting to spread a story by any means necessary. Now remember, Jesus was killed for insurrection, accused of attempting to establish his own kingdom in the heart of the Roman Empire. It's no wonder that his followers faced persecution and censorship as well. And as his followers scattered, they told and retold stories in new locations to new audiences, often with no first-hand witnesses present to fact-check them on their stories. Whether or not Jesus actually performed miracles or resurrected from the dead isn't really the purview of this video. But regardless, just like Christians today, attempting to gain followers, save people from hell, or grow their communities, the early church certainly had an incentive to exaggerate. And we know how easily stories change from one retelling to the next. Though there's no way to know for sure just how much the stories of the Bible evolved during this oral stage of its development, it's undeniable that this period of transmission was highly volatile. And when the first gospel was eventually written down, it almost certainly wasn't penned by an eyewitness. The names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John aren't on any of our oldest manuscripts, but the gospels were later attributed to them to lend them credibility. And almost all Christian and secular experts agree that we have no idea who actually wrote them. The author of Luke admits that he's not getting his information firsthand. He and Matthew verbatim copy massive chunks of their text directly from Mark, who wasn't one of the 12 disciples, which is odd because if the author of Matthew was Jesus' disciple Matthew, then why is he copying his information from other sources rather than simply recording his own eyewitness testimony? Oh, and Mark, who they're copying from, probably had never even been to the region where the events took place because he makes mistakes when writing about the local geography, lacks basic familiarity with Jewish customs, and he misquotes the Jewish scriptures. John is written later and has a way different message than the 3 synoptic gospels, and the author of John doesn't claim to be a disciple, but says that he's getting his information at least secondhand based on the testimony of a disciple who Jesus loved. But even if they were written by eyewitnesses, we know that eyewitness testimony is actually one of the worst forms of evidence. The Innocence Project has gotten countless people off of death row who were condemned to die based on eyewitness testimony, only to be exonerated when DNA evidence proved beyond the shadow of a doubt that they couldn't have been the perpetrator of the crime in question. Our eyes don't function like video cameras. Our attention is selective, and so are our memories. We know that people hallucinate, can develop false memories, and that memories change over time. When the texts of the Gospels were finally written down, they were recorded in Greek. But Jesus spoke Aramaic, so there's already a shift in language, which inevitably brings with it some change in meaning. We don't have any records of the original Aramaic teachings of Jesus for us to be able to verify that these early texts were an accurate translation, and the Gospel authors also recorded things that there's no way that they could have known, like the words and actions of Jesus when he was alone. These early texts were all handwritten, before word processors, before computers and the internet, before the printing press, and before copyright law. The only way to make a copy would be to write one out by hand. There was no way to guarantee that someone copying your work wouldn't change it, either deliberately or by accidental copying errors. And the vast, vast majority of the population at the time were illiterate. Even of the ones who could read and write, most did so incredibly poorly, which is why when we compare ancient Greek manuscripts from this time, we see so many misspellings, accidental duplications or omissions of text, and changes to word order. There were mistakes due to mishearing dictated words or due to transcribers' eyes missing a line, and that's not even counting discounting all of the changes made out of deliberate intent. Even though we don't have that many extant texts from before the 3rd century, we know that copying errors and deliberate changes were commonplace at this time because we have at least 4 different accounts of it taking place. Accounts from both church fathers complaining about it and by critics of Christianity calling it out. In the 2nd century, criticizing Christianity, Celsus points out that Christians eagerly changed the text of their scriptures as though in a fit of drunkenness so as to be able to defend their beliefs against criticism. Even the early church father Origen, despite defending Christianity against Celsus' many other criticisms, admitted elsewhere that this was a major problem, complaining that the differences among the manuscripts of the Gospels have become great, either through negligence of some copyists or through the perverse audacity of others. They either neglect to check over what they have transcribed, or in the process of checking, they lengthen or shorten as they please. The early Christian theologian Jerome recounted how copyists would write down not what they find, but what they think is the meaning, and while they attempt to rectify the errors of others, they merely expose their own. And as early as 180 CE, the church father Irenaeus denounced the theologian Marcion as a heretic because he was tweaking and removing large sections of the gospel and Paul's epistles in order to support his own beliefs that conflicted with those of Irenaeus. And this isn't a controversial thing. Even most Christian Bible scholars today will acknowledge that this was occurring at that time, like when Daniel Wallace pointed out that Revelation was copied less than any other book in the New Testament, and yet Irenaeus admits that it was already corrupted within just a few decades of the writing of the Apocalypse. All of this was happening. It was commonplace from the time that the original autographs of the New Testament books were first copied. And we don't have a single shred of surviving text of any New Testament book for nearly a century while all of these copying shenanigans were taking place. It's not until the 2nd century that we get our first sliver of New Testament papyrus which has survived to this day, P52. It contains a fragment of a few verses and is about the size of a credit card.
That's all there is?
This process of hand copying and altering the text continued for another century, still with barely any surviving texts. The only extant New Testament manuscripts that we have from this period are a handful of papyrus scraps. In fact, almost all of our New Testament manuscripts come from after the 2nd century. Papyrus doesn't tend to survive long, especially in wet or humid climates, and for the first few hundred years, Christianity faced censorship and persecution, both from the Roman Empire and from Christians accusing each other of heresy while fighting over doctrine. Many Christian texts were gathered up and deliberately destroyed, and I cannot stress enough that there wasn't just one Christianity. What we consider as the Bible wasn't fixed upon for the first few hundred years of the early church. There were countless versions of Christianity and a plethora of other Gospels, Acts, epistles, and apocalypses, deemed by some churches as Holy Scripture and by others as heresy. Which books were considered canonical changed from one region to the next and from one decade to the next. For example, one of the largest collections of non-canonical Gospels ever found is believed to have been buried to avoid destruction by church censors. Discovered in Egypt in 1945, it's known as the Nag Hammadi Library, and it contains texts supporting a polytheistic Gnostic version of Christianity in which the Earth's creator is actually an evil deity. It's not until the mid-4th century that we have our oldest surviving New Testament, Codex Sinaiticus, and even that included books no longer deemed as canonical, like the Epistle of Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hermas, as well as books of the Apocrypha. We don't find the current 27 books of the New Testament listed together as recommended canon until 367 CE or AD by Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria. And even then, there were disputes over the authenticity of Hebrews, James, 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, and Revelation. It wouldn't be until 393 CE at the Council of Hippo, over 350 years after Jesus' death, that the 27 books of the New Testament would be officially canonized. And even then, 3 pseudepigraphal books claiming to be written by the Apostle Paul, which scholars today almost universally agree weren't actually written by Paul, managed to sneak their way into the official canon as Holy Scripture, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. Now, for the most part, this version of the Bible is what stuck with us. At least for the Catholic Church. Orthodox and Ethiopian Bibles have different biblical canons, and as for Protestants, well, roughly 1,000 years after Hippo, they would deem 11 of these books to be non-canonical, along with massive chunks of Daniel and Esther, but they kept them in the Bible until the 1800s when they were removed to save money on printing costs.
You've got to be kidding me.
There was also a pseudepigraphal forgery claiming to be Paul's letter to the Laodiceans, which was endorsed by Pope Gregory in the 5th century, resulting in its adoption into many later Latin, English, and Germanic versions of the Bible, but it was eventually rejected at the Second Council of Nicaea. Finally, I should also note that only the Orthodox Tawahedo churches include the Book of Enoch in their canon, even though the author of Jude explicitly quotes from it as Holy Scripture, and Jude is accepted as biblical canon by every major church today. But once Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, thanks to Emperor Constantine, it started receiving more support and funding, and the process of copying the New Testament finally began to be standardized and taken more seriously. Copying errors, mistakes, and deliberate changes declined, but they didn't disappear altogether. In 382, the Pope Damasus I realized just how varied the manuscripts of the New Testament had become, and commissioned Jerome to standardize the Bible into Latin, creating the Latin Vulgate. Our oldest surviving copy of the Vulgate dates to 547 CE, although there are some partial copies from earlier. And while that seems pretty old, remember that that's over 500 years after Jesus died, and that during the most volatile period of transmission of the biblical stories, the 1st century after Jesus' death, we don't have a single shred of surviving texts, and from the 2nd century, it's really not much better. Since the creation of the Vulgate, there have been a deluge of attempts to recreate the original text of the New Testament autographs, as well as to translate the New Testament into every language imaginable. And with each attempt comes a new wave of translation errors, copying mistakes, omissions, additions, and interpretations, deliberate or otherwise, which have led to quite literally thousands of different versions of the Bible, as well as thousands of different Christian denominations. But even if you ignore all of the modern variants, if you go back to our ancient manuscripts, just how different are they? If they were divinely inspired, shouldn't they also be divinely preserved? Well, in 1707, after 30 years of work with 100 Greek New Testament manuscripts at his disposal, John Mill published his Novum Testamentum Graecum, or the Greek New Testament, in which he outlined his discovery of roughly 30,000 textual variants between the manuscripts. I should note that Mill actually discovered way more than 30,000, but he excluded minor variations like differences in word order that didn't affect the overall meaning of the text. This sent a shockwave through the Christian world. Well, at least among the few educated elite who had access to, books and stuff. Well, at least the ones of them who could read Greek. Okay, it barely made a dent in the average person's belief in divine preservation of the perfect inerrant Bible, but it sent shockwaves through academia and rustled quite a few feathers within the church. Since Mill, we've actually discovered significantly more manuscripts, and older ones at that, and with them, significantly more variations between the texts. In 1897, Eberhard Nestle estimated the number of variants to be between 120 and 150,000. And with more scholars scrutinizing the text, more text to scrutinize, and better tools/better access to the text in question, estimates have continued to rise. By 2016, Peter J. Gurry estimated that, not counting minor variations in spelling, the number of variants is likely over 500,000. And these aren't just secular scholars pointing this out. The New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary has been scouring through ancient biblical manuscripts, comparing them with each other. And after 11 years of work, they had discovered over 17,000 pages of variations. Their work is ongoing. According to Bible scholar Bart Ehrman, even with the advances in computing technology, no one has successfully counted all of the variations between our manuscripts. But needless to say,
one thing we can say for certain is that there are more differences in our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. And those are just the manuscripts we have. How many differences were there earlier? We don't know.
But just how serious are these changes? Well, it would appear that while some are quite substantial, the vast majority of them are rather minor, inconsequential differences that don't affect the meaning of the text in the slightest. And honestly, I would say that it's surprising that there aren't more variations and more serious differences if it weren't for the fact that we don't have that many texts from before the 3rd century. And we know that after the standardization of biblical canon, the establishment of church doctrine at various councils, and the completion of the Latin Vulgate, any surviving texts which disagreed with the now established dogma were gathered up and disposed of. Hence why the Nag Hammadi library, or Gnostic text which I mentioned earlier, was buried, and why its discovery was such a rare find. Who knows just how many other non-canonical texts have been lost to history because they simply weren't preserved or were deliberately destroyed by the church. It's quite likely that, say, the original Gospel of Mark, for example, was deemed heretical and disposed of by early church fathers in favor of an altered variant. Because even among the canonical books of the New Testament, when we examine our oldest Greek texts, we find shocking variations between them, like the addition to Mark 16:14 in Codex Washingtonianus, where Jesus indicates that Satan's rule over earth is already over, rather than an ongoing war between light and dark as indicated in other New Testament manuscripts. We even find evidence of deliberate tampering with the text, changes which have worked their way into our modern Bibles. But I'll have to cover those changes in my next video. Now, I used to believe that every single word in the Bible was directly inspired by God and then divinely preserved. It was unthinkable to me that humans could possibly tweak or alter its message in any way. But obviously they have, and they do. Since I started reconsidering my faith nearly a decade ago, this has hardly been the only religious idea that I've reevaluated. But deconstructing your entire worldview is hard, and establishing a new set of beliefs based on truth can be even tougher, especially when we're surrounded by a sea of competing ideas. Which is why I recommend, past me? What the heck are you doing? Well, I'm trying to figure out how the world works using logic and reason and science and critical thinking, but just when I thought that I had it all figured out, this theologian named William Lane Craig started blasting me with religious apologetics, and his word salad is so confusing. So I've mapped out all of his arguments in the form of logical syllogisms, and now I'm going through Wikipedia and memorizing an extensive list of logical fallacies and trying to see if any of his arguments hold water. Dude, why don't you just play Debunked? What now? There's literally a card game that you can play where you pair fallacious arguments with the logical fallacies that they commit. It's super fun, fast-paced, and has hilarious illustrations. Plus, you and your friends learn how to spot logical fallacies and think more rationally. Won't that make William Lane Craig cry? That's half the fun! But it sounds too simple! I still need to memorize all these arguments first, at least, right? Nope. You just need to know the rules of the game, which take like 2 minutes to learn. Well, I need to know all the logical fallacies at least first. Not even. You don't mean to say that I just wasted the last 10 hours writing out all these syllogisms? Can't I just, finish them first or something? I only have a few more hours to go. I mean, you can, but why reinvent the wheel when Debunked is so much easier and way more fun? Plus, this way you don't have to give up your social life. Just click the link in the video description below and snag your copy of Debunked today. Trust me, you'll thank me later.
Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause.